Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunnstreet. Dunnstreet is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. Dunnstreet also trains engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to build power and create change in your community, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel daunting. That's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace issues to medical issues, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates and planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with experience you can count on. And to contact Maurice Blackburn, simply go to their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, like lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, and events that will energize the community both online and offline. And sometimes you even need text blasts that distills your message perfectly. Guess what? SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, simply go to swiftfoxcrm.com and they will help you win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, which drops every Friday morning and dives into the progressive campaigns and issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And today we're going to be joined by the Australian Council of Trade Unions Assistant Secretary, Scott Connolly. Scott's been on the show before. In fact, the last time we spoke to Scott was during COVID, and I wanted to get Scott back on the show just to give us a bit of an update on where things are at in the union movement across the country, where they're focusing their energies on. A lot's changed since we last spoke, where Labor keeps on winning elections. So there's a lot of Labor governments around, and it would be good to have a chat to Scott about that relationship and where their focus is going forward to help keep on improving the wages and conditions of working people in this country of ours. So look forward to that episode with Scott today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And once you've done listen to the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and leave us a review. And for all the updates, follow Dunnstreet on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And it's been a while between drinks. The last time I had this guy on, I think we were coming out of COVID, and I just thought it's about time to check in with our brothers and sisters in the trade union movement. So I'm joined on the line again by the Assistant Secretary of the ACTU, Scott Connolly. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
G'day, Stephen. Fantastic to be here, mate, and good to see you as well. It has been a while, but lots to talk about, I think. I think I get a twitch when you mention COVID and pandemic, but we've all got through it, surprisingly, and I think remarkably, when we think about it, it is really hard to contemplate where we were 2 years ago, even really 12 months ago, and how quickly things have moved on at one level when you sort of think about it. But then I think how significant that time was, and I think how significant it was for Victorians in particular. I think we sort of underestimate the difference between the experiences of those in Victoria, as you and I were at the time, and the other states.
You've actually just now, I'm not even going to ask my first question because I actually want to ask you about this, because we did talk about this last time you were on the show, the things that the union movement learned through the pandemic, how to adapt, how to organise in workplaces when you can't get access because of restrictions. What has been some of the key learnings that the union movement have taken out of that COVID period that you're now embracing
Yeah, I think we've got better at organising. I think we've got a lot more efficient and effective in terms of using the resources that we have and finding workarounds. I think we obviously had to do that, but it's also become more commonplace that the work well, and I think probably a better way of saying this is the workaround is becoming the commonplace today, be it virtual or a combination of digital mechanisms, other ways of communicating. Yeah, not sort of the traditional ways I organised. Standing out the front of the gate of a trucking yard, and if you couldn't do that, then it was a crisis. How are you going to talk to the workers? I think, and then it was some workshop about, well, what else can we do? Those aren't conversations I think we're having. We're just getting on with this is the reality of one, how people work, and then equally how we organise. And I think that's, from a practical sense, dragged us forward significantly to the world of work, and probably sped up some of the movement's challenges we had about organising in an environment and in a workplace that had rapidly changed, probably faster than we had. And I think the pandemic has sped and enabled us to, I'm not saying we're ahead of it yet, but I think we're more keeping a pace with how work is organising itself, and our capacity to deal with that. And that's, absolute positive out of the pandemic. Negative is the pace of work, the volume of work, all have been compressed, of course, and that's a challenge I think that we need to be equally frank about our capacity to meet that from the movement's perspective. Is something that I think requires a lot of thinking and reframing our approaches and how we use the resources we have. But I think tempering that is probably, I'm sure we'll get onto this momentarily, is really just the challenges confronting workers are so much more pronounced. Like they were big then, absolutely, in terms of uncertainty, layoffs. But we did remarkably well in so many respects because of the work we did with income support, maintaining people in jobs, transitioning to digital platforms to work and retain continuity. And it's amazing what we were able to achieve through that period. Now with the economic environment changing so significantly, that is really biting the workers that we represent, particularly those most in need of unionisation and our assistance.
What are some of those key challenges that they're at the front of mind that have come out of the pandemic that the union movement needs to address?
Well, I think it's those points I made about compression, about volume, about the pace of work. Like, they are having big impacts on the labour market at so many levels. And I think there's a real question for the nation about what does this look like if we continue like this over the decade, and what does it mean for our society and our community? It's a big question, of course, but I think if we don't sort of pause to think about it and take a moment to shape what we want it to look like, we're on a pathway that's pretty confronting for workers, for communities, and it's not something that excites us. That's the path we want to go down. So conversations that we're having now about 4-day weeks, about the right to disconnect, are all very much about how do we respond to this trajectory that we seem to be on. I think they're sort of significant. And then, of course, the challenges are out, what's changed in work, what's changed in terms of workplace pressures, bosses' expectations, how workers respond to that and mobilise against that, are all realities. And then inflation's a big killer. It's just, eating away at workers, real incomes today. And we're seeing wages go backwards now and on a pathway to continue to go backwards, but for a significant uplift in wages, and that's hard to see that occurring with inflation at 6.8, 7.2, depending on how you look at it. That hurts, and it is hurting working people, and will continue to do so for a period of time. It appears.
Let's talk about wages to begin with. I feel like something weird happened last year in 2022 for both the federal election and also the Victorian state election, where the central campaign issue was centered around cost of living. Now, historically, if you were to frame a campaign on that particular issue, that would be death for the Labor Party. But in this case, a lot of the research, even before election day, certainly in the federal one, indicated that Labor by voters were regarded as the stronger of the two major parties to address cost of living. And I think part of it was to do with the conversation that was being elevated by both the party but also the union movement, centered around wages and wage growth and how that matches with inflation. Do you agree that the conversation has started to shift in that respect?
Fundamentally, I think it has. I think we're getting better at um, at owning this space as a movement. I think, and rightly so, and being frank and upfront with people. It's one of these secrets about organising. I think it's the key about meeting people where they're at, to start a conversation and start a journey. Wherever you're taking them, and that is people's lived experience. And overwhelmingly the negative here. I think if you really think about the reality is that the experience of a decade of coalition government, overwhelmingly, certainly federally, but then equally across the country, with one glaring exception, the state we live in, has dragged working people backwards so far, and that sort of you know, the experience of people struggling to make ends meet, heavy in debt, really slaves to work, and the interest rate cycle has meant things were so tenuous. And I think that pandemic broke all of that. Massive government intervention appropriately, but created, to in part, the challenges we're now confronted with in terms of how do you manage that as a nation, and then how do you deal with rocketing inflation at the same time. And the experience of workers and communities, I think, had come to the fore and has really cut through, and really asking us collectively to question about what's the role of government, what's the role of state, what's the role of the movement to play in terms of addressing that question, and meeting the needs of workers and communities today, where they're at. And I think that's it's a cyclical thing, and I think it's encouraging that we're there, but it's also significantly challenging and daunting when you think about how do we, as the labour movement, solve that and maintain the momentum that we've been able to achieve, but equally manage expectations, while delivering real outcomes for people that matter. And that's a real battle, as I'm sure your listeners can imagine.
The remedy to this situation, I mean, historically, whenever we've had an economy that's overheating, and for those of us old enough to remember the 90s, the early 90s recession, the Reserve Bank said, right, we just need to really bring in, raise interest rates, to bring down inflation, and also say to government, we need to put a clamp on wage growth. But I feel like now that I've said this to our listeners plenty of times, I am no economist by any stretch of the imagination, but I just feel like the commentariat, certainly on the left, are starting to say, hang on a minute, this current climate that we're in, the reason why we have inflation isn't because of, wage growth. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And the reason why we've got inflation is a whole bunch of other reasons that, we really can't put the burden on households. And the newly elected New South Wales Labor government has said that they're going to remove that wages cap that was put in place by the previous Liberal government. Federal Minister for Workplace Relations, Tony Burke, has supported the principle that minimum wages needs to rise in line with inflation. Want to get a sense of what the ACTU's policy on wages is in terms of a remedy to address both inflation, but ensure that workers actually are getting more in their take-home pay each week, and more than that were getting last year and the year before that and the year before that.
Yeah, and I think the how do you deal with there's the immediate imperative, of course, around keeping up with the pace of inflation. And it's great to see the outcome we got last year in the minimum wage was a good step in that direction. Absolutely, most significant increase we've had awarded in close to 30 years, I think. But we're up again now, and we're sort of, as we speak, advocating the case in front of the tribunal for this year's increase. And again, the imperative hasn't changed at all. It's got harder for working people, hence the imperative to see a decision as significant, if not more significant, in that factor as last year, is in front of us in the immediate term. We're hopeful, and we're absolutely advocating that that's critical, that the tribunal awards the minimum keeping threshold question of keeping up with the cost of living, so meet the inflation. And we've asked for it rightly to be beyond that, in fact, in terms of our submission this year, marginally beyond it, to sort of reflect the realities of the pool, the realities of cost of living for people, not in a theoretical sense. So I think that's the immediate. I think the other thing is really the levers we have as a movement to respond. So the bargaining laws are pretty important in this regard, and moving on, reigniting those other mechanisms in workplaces to advocate for wages additional to the minimums. And great to see our movement sort of really picking up in large parts both the appetite to use the new legislation, but then equally strategically using well the mechanisms we've had up to now in terms of being able to lock in cost of living increases using CPI clauses in agreements. And that makes a big difference, of course, to have that protection. And over the last couple of years, we started to see an increase in a return to what was traditional when I was about bargaining agreements, including a CPI savings clause at the back end of the wages component of the wage deal. So that's another practical, realistic thing we're doing now. We've got the new bargaining laws coming into force in, I think, 78 days now, and of course we're ambitious about how we're planning on rolling them out. I think the other thing I'd say in this regard, Stephen, is thinking also about you mentioned the last sort of big recession, I guess, and not saying we're down that path, despite everything probably telling us in our guts that I think that is going to be really, really hard to avoid. And that's a confronting admission to make, given what that means for our communities in terms of unemployment, in terms of increased cost of living, in terms of its impact on people in work, let alone those not yet in work and coming back into work or leaving school, trying to find a job in a very, very different labour market than what we have today. But that last period of reform, it was a big period of reform. The lever that we've experienced for the last decade has been, it's the RBA's job, and everything else is left to the market. Has really been that was the level of sophistication of the philosophy of the predecessors in Canberra, and it was so much more in the early 90s. There was skilling the nation, working Australia, IR reform, like the whole process of shifting to enterprise bargaining happened in 91, 93. Like that was another big shift. And we will now say, of course, 30 years on, 40 years on, that that was the start of some of the challenges we're facing in terms of an erosion of, union influence and capacity to bargain and achieve our wage outcomes. But it was a big part of the lever. The other was, of course, skilling and retraining. So what's really encouraging in terms of the current occupants of the Treasury benches in Canberra is that they're equally thinking about this in broad structural reform terms. It's not just interest rates, while they're thinking about reforming and restructuring those institutions and having a broader toolbox to deal with these challenges. There's equally a conversation happening about reskilling and retraining. There's capitalising those other challenges. So it's not it's a comprehensive response, and I think that's encouraging. It's harder, of course, and there's lots more balls to juggle, but I think it's sort of insightful to sort of think back that really that period 90, 91 was a big part of setting us up for the 30, 40 years of prosperity that we've been able to achieve. It's 30 plus years we've been without a recession. A lot of that building was done in those years, 91 to 96, and of course the 7-8 years beforehand.
It feels like, you look back at, I don't know if the timing of this is coincidental, but you look back at when the Great Southern Standard, the MCG, was first built in 91. We're looking at it going, wow, what an amazing stand that is! What an amazing piece of architecture. And 30 years later, you're looking at going, geez, that's an old, decrepit looking building, and they want to renovate it. I mean, obviously, the reforms that you're speaking of back in the 90s were incredibly significant. I feel like we're at this moment again where we need to go back in and go, right, what are the new ideas? Because so much has changed in terms of the economy and community and how we interact with each other. How significant are these bargaining reforms that are about to be brought in terms of helping workers uh, address the issues at a local level in their workplace or across industries or across communities? And just talk us through some of the significant amendments or
Yeah,
changes that have been made.
yeah. Look, this is a really, obviously really exciting. Like we spent a lot of time thinking about what's required to bluntly re-empower workers in workplaces to be more effective to achieve outcomes for them and their workmates, and beyond that in their community. So fundamental reform, the biggest reforms we've had to our industrial relations in 30 years, and a big part of parts of the reforms go to subgender equities, rights around discrimination and access, just fundamental protections that should have happened decades ago. And yeah, so these are really significant reforms. They go to fundamentally just re-empowering workers in workplaces. So we're seeing the primacy of the industrial parties sort of re-established in the system, and that's sort of a critical piece of this puzzle. And the right for workers to be represented by their trade unions re-entrenched back into the bargaining framework. Equally, seeing an onus on that favours the agreement making provisions. As the precondition of achieving wage outcomes, where we've seen really now for close to that 30-year period, it's been the reverse. It's individual contracts. It's the removal of the promise of the industrial parties out of the system that have sort of taken us on the journey that has been designed to achieve the wage outcomes that we've experienced, fundamentally today, and similarly the level of challenges that the movements are confronted with in terms of membership numbers, in terms of density and resources. All those things are occurred by design. So we're picking those pieces up and seeking to put them back together, but doing so in a way that reflects, as far as possible, in the confines of legislative reform, the world of work today, and the bargaining relationships that are present today. So I think we've thought about this in terms of the traditional bargains, single enterprise agreements. So there's a stream there that picks up that. There's a stream that picks up the reality that across many workplaces there is different forms of competition occurring. There's different forms of similarity. So the option and capacity for industry agreements and multi-employer agreements again is a significant reform that sort of takes as much as possible, or has the potential to take as much as possible wages out of competition across sectors in parts of the economy that really makes a massive difference. And then recognition of some other areas around supported services and why they're different, why in the state and more public sectors the reality of the funding models in those sectors mean that there's a different relationship that sort of necessitates a different form of bargain and a different outcome potentially as well. So it's a really significant piece of reform. It's close to becoming law and becoming operative, and we're sort of hopeful that we can get on with the job of utilising and using them. But we're equally cognizant that it's a long time since the movement and the nation really has had a set of laws like this, and the experience and capacity for all of us to utilise and make the most of this opportunity isn't lost on us. So we're thinking and investing a lot at the moment in training and education and taking people through what the laws mean and the opportunities that they present. But I think it's equally trying to think through how do we use them strategically going forward, and sort of that question about where's the opportunities to act strategically, where's the opportunities for the movement to cooperate to get a strategic outcome that adds value, and then equally, as the laws do come in all force and become operative, share those experiences. And I think the risk is we sort of go back to our silos, we go back to our industries, and we but sort of get distracted by the imperative of the deal and the bargain, where I think the big piece and the big opportunity here is continuing to share and learn and you know uh, um, I guess accelerate the reforms and their success by being able to ensure that we're bringing people along and mentoring people along through shared experiences across industries, across sectors, and across unions. And for the ACTU, of course, it's our core business, and we're very much focused on making sure we're able to remain true to that objective as much as achieving industry outcomes.
One thing that started to forgive me if I'm getting stuck in the weeds here, but one thing that really kind of broke my brain when I started to hear about this is, and I want to cite two examples, and I'm going to probably stuff this up in terms of our CPSU brothers and sisters, but them trying to negotiate with the then former Conservative federal government around their nationwide EBA for Commonwealth public sector workers just dragged on forever and ever and ever, and a lack of willingness by the government, the employer, to actually meet with the union and try and get an outcome. The second one was McDonald's, who simply just walked away from the negotiations with that union, the SDA, and said, stuff it, we're going to put all the workers back on the award. And when I heard these two examples, different examples, but basically the core root, which was an employer not wanting to bargain with an employee or a union, I was thinking, this is broken. What has been what is in this new legislation that does address this? Has this been addressed? Are you satisfied that you can actually get in a situation where we get both parties back to the table and talking with one another?
Yeah, I think we've conceptualised how you do that, and our history sort of tells us there's a big role for the Fair Work Commission to do that. The laws enable the arbitral powers to be re-exercised by the commission. So that's a really key thing. There's similarly, the onus is on the bargain to occur. The onus on the parties to bargain fairly is all there, and the powers of the commission to ensure those things are occurring is equally sort of re-enlivened and reinvigorated under the Act. I think significantly also the 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 power of the commission to conciliate matters is increased as well, and ensure that with directions powers, there can't be the examples like you've said, people walking away from the bargaining table because the onus of power has shifted to the industrial party as opposed to the employer in that context, or similarly the opportunity for people to walk away, to delay and protract bargaining is similarly dealt with by enabling the tribunal to intervene where they think, and I think the threshold is 9 months, and there's an explicit provision in the Act that calls out that as a period of time where if there isn't a bargain reached, then there's an onus on the Commission to review and potentially insert itself into a situation like that. And I think we've just seen an example of this, not directly related, but a protracted dispute, ongoing at Switzer in the maritime sector has just been settled on the back of 4 years in advance of the new laws coming into force. So I think the parties sort of recognise that the landscape's changing, and if we're going to rebuild our bargaining system and reactivate it, and it's us and the employers that are saying the system's broken. The path to wage increases and productivity has to be workplace based, has to be productivity focused. Giving power back to the parties is critical to that, but equally giving and empowering the tribunal with a role to ensure that the overall economy-wide objectives of our labour market are being met and monitored through this system is really critical, because we did see that the former legislation, it was invariably a law of the jungle, and it was, if you had power you got away with things and you were able to exercise it to everyone's detriment. And we've seen that played out, of course, in cases you've identified, and I've just identified in terms of Switzer. There's many others, but most significantly it's the wage outcomes that we're experiencing across the economy. And we all know, both our side of this conversation, that the industrial battle, labour and capital, that we can't sustain that. The nation needs a lift in wages, and it's only going to come from bargaining in workplaces and a safety net properly and appropriately lifted and increased.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energize the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. The other thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of broadly, I guess it's bargaining, but it goes to the heart of enterprise agreements and agreements about how unions can conduct themselves in workplaces. I know that when I was a union organiser, it was getting harder and harder, and I can imagine years since then it's been even more difficult for organisers to go in and actually organise workers, right of entry provisions, where you can go and hang out. I remember, driving all the way to Bairnsdale to go sit in a tea room at Super Cheap Auto for the manager there to tell the workers, don't go into the tea room, because there's a union guy in there, right? So I stubbornly sat there all day, but I don't have all day to sit in that tea room, in Bairnsdale and do a 3-hour drive back to Melbourne. Is there ways in which the union movement's trying to address that issue? And also, I did start to read some stuff maybe earlier in the year about the bargaining fees, about those workers that are getting the benefits of a union agreement but aren't a member of the union. And I know that was a conversation way back when I was a young bloke. I think was it the Electrolux decision or something came up, went to the High Court and it kind of got knocked on the head. And have we tried to revisit that? Where's the union movement in that kind of conversation with government and employers?
Yeah, look, there's more reform needed. I think is probably the easiest way to answer it. The case, and we have an appetite for more reform, and there's live conversations occurring, and there's a bill, that the government sort of indicated it's working on now to be introduced at the back end in the spring session, that goes to sort of some of these issues, not all of them, and I think the issues you've raised about right of entry and bargaining fees are matters that we're trying to work through and think through what's the solution there. There isn't a movement-wide view about one specific solution. I think we all agree on the problem, but in terms of a consensus of a solution, and there's varieties of ways I think we can think through and solve these issues. I think fundamentally legislation will be able to do so much, and we've got to also, I think about what's already been achieved in terms of the legislative package, how significant the multi-employer bargaining stream is or could be, going forward. How significant the Act that's just passed at the end of last year is in terms of massive amount of reform, more reform to come in terms of same job, same pay, gig and transport workers, new forms of work being empowered and able to be given a floor through reforms that the government's committed to, all of which is on our plate now. And then equally the reality that the legislation will only be as good as us that use it. So I think, the movement thinking about there's a legislative fix to all of these problems. We can make everybody pay a union fee or a fair rider fee. That's going to solve our problems. I think we're kidding ourselves, in my personal view, not the ACTU's view. That's a Clayton solution to a fundamental challenge about how we organise, how we go about connect with workers, how we win people to our cause. And I've always been a believer that I rather a member that's prepared to make a contribution and be a genuine one, rather than one that's there reluctantly, no matter the contribution, because that's a level of activism that makes a real difference, and it's a level of commitment that makes a real difference. And I think that's a big discussion we've got in front of us. As this issue isn't going to go away from us, but I think it's silly. It's not. I think it's simplistic to think that legislation is going to solve all of these problems for us. I think they're bigger than the capacity of the Parliament, and I think already we've got so much opportunity in front of us to get on with using that we should. We need to do that. We need to bed these laws in. And then absolutely we need to think differently and strategically about how we also solve these other problems. You mentioned right of entry. Look, that's a threshold issue. We're working through that absolutely. And I think there's a lot of reforms happening there about that regulation, about other regulations of unions that we'll see addressed over the course of this year, hopefully. but more work to do. But the biggest piece of this work is using the laws we've already won, I think, and demonstrating that they are making a difference for working people. And I think the potential is that they absolutely can. And a challenge for the movement is one that we have to make sure that we demonstrate that, because I don't think I can see us seeing an opportunity like this again. So we've got to make the most of what we've got.
You make a really good point there, and obviously this predominantly is an organising podcast, not a policy podcast, and I do want to flip the conversation to that. I mean, the evolution of organising in workplaces here in Australia, I'm just wondering about this opportunity that you're talking about. Where does the union movement go in terms of strategising new ways in which they can build workers' power, leverage the resources that they've got, come up with new ideas, all these new tools that have become available to us because of COVID, for example. I mean, if I was a union organiser now and realising there are other ways, and you highlighted it before, than just standing at the front of a yard trying to get people's attention. What's the conversation around organising now? What are we seeing from affiliated unions where they are having some successes post-COVID in terms of organising workers, identifying leadership and developing that?
Yeah, look, I think it's really exciting. I think it's daunting, Stephen. I think at one level, I think we look around a room and see this shit. Like, there's probably, a room of 50 union officials. There might be, 10 or 20 that have experienced laws like we have now in that audience, and that's a significant challenge. And it's one about how do you mentor what we know and have within the movements, collective knowledge, and make sure it's transferred going forward. But then equally, how we continue to learn and evolve. And I think we're alive to that and cognizant of the risk and thinking about how we deal with that. And we're really good at that. I think our capacity to, good and bad, I think, to be honest, but we are good about learning through experience. And I think they can be good and bad experiences, but I think we do a really good job in a tactile sense, getting on with the job of organising, winning and losing for workers, because that's how we learn, and I think it's the best way. And I think that's the opportunity in front of the movement now. And I think it's really exciting to see there is a real appetite from them across the movement to really just get on with the opportunity in front of us. So be it in aged and healthcare, we've already had massive wins in those sectors already, and an appetite to do so much more across those supply chains. There's the manufacturing sector. There's what's happening in the gig economy and across other parts of the transport sector, the issues around mental health. It's a really, really exciting time, let alone the massive successes we've had in our public sector, be it in West Australia, one example, but then in New South Wales, I think enormous amounts of action that hasn't. It's been decades and decades since we've had workers in the rail sector, in the education sector take action. And in that state, let alone any other state, and they've not only achieved significant outcomes. You mentioned the removal of the cap. The second state now to make that commitment and sort of getting on with the job, a massive difference for public sector workers. The biggest group of still unionised workers in the country remain in the public sector. So they're really, really big reforms to the movement and its opportunity, but all come about from the action of workers, losing money and taking strike, the traditional mechanisms of going on strike. So I think that's really, really exciting and insightful. But what's equally exciting, it's not just us. Like the level of action across the globe is extraordinary. If you think about what's happened in the UK, or be it in the US at Amazon or Starbucks, or Europe, these are really, really big mobilisations of workers. I'm listening earlier today about the screenwriters. It's 15 years since there's been strikes of screenwriters in the US entertainment sector, and that's exciting for the movement in terms of the mobilisation of people to action, absolutely. But it's also a stark reminder, I think, for how important it is for us as leaders to act and capitalise and deliver. Because the action people have been driven, partly driven to, I think, is just because they are being driven to it, because things are so hard, because it is really tough to put food on the table, to make ends meet, and that's not getting any easier. So tough times, drive people to action and desperation. And I think the opportunity for movement and responsibility is to make the most of the environment that we're in.
And young people getting involved as well, particularly in the stuff that we're seeing coming out of the United States around workers in Amazon and Starbucks and getting organised under really tough conditions. Like, it is not easy. And we've had, folks from the RWDSU on the podcast before. Not easy to get organised in the US as it is in Australia, and to get outcomes, but to see young people getting their shit together, and, organising in courageous circumstances must be really positive, broadly speaking, for the union movement around the world, looking at going, okay, there is light at the end of the tunnel in some respects.
Absolutely, and it's really exciting, and it's inspirational for other workers. Like, to see us achieving 8% wage outcomes, or 5% wage outcomes, or 11% wage outcomes in some instances is extraordinary. Like, that's unheard of. To think about even in our most strongest and successful sectors in the last decade, wage outcomes like that, unheard of. Now we need them, absolutely, but we're achieving them. So credit to the workers that are taking action, but it sort of demonstrates that the recipe for success here and delivery is pretty clear. Different ways about going about it, but it's workers taking action, collectivising, and mobilising is pretty fundamental, and I think it's really encouraging that we're seeing it happen, but equally encouraging that we're able to sort of point to those opportunities as we in this country, really have a once in a lifetime opportunity in front of us with legislative change at governments. Not that they're friendly to people going on strike or receptive of public sector workers or construction workers taking action, but they understand why and have a sense of empathy why. That's a necessary step that some workers will have to take to achieve an outcome.
Can we talk about superannuation, which is risky for me, because when I was a TW organiser doing an EBA rollout, I dreaded the superannuation question from that toll worker at the back of the room who was about to retire, because I didn't know the answer. When I was 26, I had paid no attention to superannuation, nor did I have any idea really how it worked. But I do want to talk about it now, because I'm getting older and now I'm starting to pay attention to my super fund, which is TW Super. You guys are starting to use the word workers' capital when referring to when referring to superannuation. I'm assuming this is intentional. Talk us through that.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think this is a really interesting area, and a bit like you, I think about this a lot in terms of the opportunity. It's extraordinary what we have done in this country in building the superannuation system. $3.5 trillion, I think, now collectively in a pool, for fifth largest savings pool across the globe. We invest more Australian workers' money offshore than we do onshore now. For the first time ever, we export capital in these super funds across the globe. And we are a really, really big and significant player in global capital markets. And I think one thing you learn as an organiser, working in labour relations, is that, fundamentally it's about power. And there's no greater power than capital and money. And what really excites, in terms of that world, like the labour relations world, what motivates action or a decision is economic to a large degree, an overwhelming degree. So to think through the opportunity that the savings of Australian workers is collectively put together at such scale and now at such level, all being deployed both in Australian domestic companies that are employing Australian workers on good terms, on bad terms, is a massive opportunity for us to think differently about how we create an expectation about our money being used in our economy, be it as an investment vehicle or as an acquisition vehicle, or ultimately a vehicle that's paying wages for workers, or globally. But if you think about it just in the domestic context, That's why we use the language and have started to use the language of workers' capital, because it tells the story that these capital pools are fundamentally ours. And it's not like we're extraordinary and an outlier, absolutely. But the savings pools of workers in pension pools across the globe is two-thirds of all money invested globally. So we're already the biggest stake. Like workers across the world are already the biggest stake at the capital markets. It's our money that UBS and BlackRock and Blackstone are playing with and making decisions for. And they're making decisions for it in our long-term interest, and that's their obligations as fiduciaries. But we also need to challenge them to think about not just the long-term. And I'm not an economist either, but I think one thing is that you get five or six in the room, and you're not going to get one opinion. You can only imagine, them trying to settle on what's the long-term interest as a question in front of you when they're making a decision to make an investment or an allocation, or invest in this company or that company. So I think challenging that to think about what's the impact of those decisions today, and think through the immediate ramifications of how this money's being used, how it's impacting workers today, because that is equally in their long-term interest. It's great to sort of think about, well, when I retire, the reality is that many workers won't have that opportunity. But if they have a really shit life, or a tragic accident on a construction site or a transport accident, what's their experience in work been like? What are the ramifications for themselves and their families? And I think these aren't theoretical for us in the labour movement. They might be for an investor, because we've sort of outsourced our capital and said, you go off and manage it in our interest, and we trust you. And I think we're trying to change that conversation, saying, well, it's actually ours, and we're not just going to outsource it. We're happy to have you manage it. Increasingly, we'd like to have more say about how it's being managed, but equally, we want you to think differently about it and have a direct line to the responsibility that it is actually workers' money, be it here or domestically. And I think it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. We think it's very important because the facts just say it is. It is our money. That's the end of the story, regardless of when we're able to access it. But it's inevitably and unfortunately, it's also a reality of why it's so contested. And I think we're probably sort of at a point here that we recognise, though, that reality is not going to change. Like it's sort of hard to sort of see a world where somehow we're going to get a consensus that it's okay that workers control 70% of the capital across the globe, and they actually really control it. I think there's lots of contested and vested interests that have a say or a stake in making sure that's not the case. Hence, it's so critical for us to continue to advocate and push back and make the case and legitimise the voice of workers in capital markets and capital pools and investment decisions. I think there's tangible outcomes in the immediate term, but equally there's really big long-term benefits for the worker community domestically and globally if we can get this setting right.
One of the areas that I'm sort of seeing, I mean, you've laid out an excellent overview of the power of workers' retirement funds, and I just do really value the reframing of it, saying it's our money, it's workers' money, and I just sort of look at maybe it's more of a case in the non-industry funds space, but certainly, correct me if I'm wrong, might be a problem, might be a challenge with the industry funds as well. But it's the fees. I think there's like around $30 billion. Australian workers get charged $30 billion worth of fees annually, which is an incredible number. And if you were to reduce those fees by even like 0.5, that sees a return of around 12% to a worker's retirement savings in the long run, which is huge. I mean, is the union movement how much leverage does a union movement to move into the non-industry fund space? Because I just feel like sort of the Australian equivalent of the Gordon Geckos on Wall Street have just seen this huge big lump of money and gone, yeah, I want to get in on that, but I also want to get my own cut. And I'm like, no, you don't get your own cut. The cut you're getting is too big for the work that you're doing on managing that fund. And I feel like the industry fund has kind of got that balance right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe they haven't. Maybe there's some space there to be work done there as well. But broadly speaking, there's a lot of people taking a lot of cut out of workers' funds, and I just think that there's an imbalance that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think it's two things I'd say. I think you're absolutely. It is a big issue, the fee issue. It's constant pressure and constant vigilance, I think, is sort of the first answer, and that includes within the industry funds, where we can't, invariably investment professionals aren't very few of them are former union organisers or have an experience of working class struggling to make ends meet. They're lucky enough to go to the investment bank or to MBA from Harvard or whatever it is. But so does it just a fundamental challenge that we have that 1-2% on a $50 million deal or whatever it is okay for them because that's just the world they occupy. Whereas we know that if it's half 1%, it's a fundamental difference for workers whose money that ultimately is at the end of the day. So we've got to continue to challenge that. We've got to go think bigger. Have our own people making those decisions, and if we can build and inoculate out of the industry fund movement our own skill sets and try and develop our own decision makers at those tables, we're going to be better placed in the long term, and we're mindful of that and thinking about how we go about doing that. I think equally, and this is probably the most immediate encouraging thing here, is that the success of industry funds now mean that we're the dominant form of our economy and our retirement savings pool. So we've got the model right there. We've got to make sure it continues to be focused. But for workers that aren't in the industry fund movement, they're joining us by droves, and that's really encouraging in terms of value for money and outcomes for Australian workers. So we are seeing a downward trajectory on fees. We've got to keep the pressure up. But equally, we've got to take the opportunity of our success to ensure that it's the model going forward and ensure that it doesn't become captured by others or lost to the old mutuals like AMP. Terrible story there. To see Australian Super become an AMP would be a disaster for all of us, but a failure of our movement if we let that happen. And we've absolutely got a responsibility to ensure that the member first focus of the model of industry funds remains the case, regardless of how big they get, how successful they get, or how global they get.
Can we talk about the inequity access issue as well from the perspective of the worker? Women retire with 24% less super than men. Women have to survive on lower super balances because on average they live 4 years longer than men. I can only think my immediate family. I've got more aunties than uncles left, and they've been living around on their own for a long time. And a lot of them probably don't even have access to super and living off the pension. 34% of single women over 60 live in income poverty. What are the key policy levers that need to change for women to ensure that they have equal retirement outcomes to the blokes?
Yeah, two parts again, I think, Stephen. One is what's happening in work and what's happening with equity. Fantastic reform we discussed earlier. Includes a pay equity obligation and a line of sight. Every agreement that's registered by the Commission going forward under the new laws has to have a consideration of the gender equity outcomes. That's a fundamental difference. The biggest lever here is work and jobs and ensuring equity of access to women to workplaces and then to wage outcomes from work. So that's probably the most significant piece here. And then in terms of super, I think we've got to think differently about how we go about making up for the mistakes of the past and our reflection of our failure really to see what was happening across the labour market and the economy in terms of the participation of women. It's now a necessity. It's now the majority of the workforce, but we're playing catch up. We need to acknowledge. Our view is we should acknowledge that we should incentivise and there should be differential treatment of women in terms of superannuation benefits. Discussion live in the movement about how you might go about doing that, and if that means men have to take a cut or stay where they are for a period while women play catch up. Frankly, I think that's probably appropriate. Similarly, what do we do about the other benefits, PPL? That's a clear imperative for us, and seeing these imbalances addressed through policy reform and ultimately legislative reform is a pretty critical part of this puzzle as well, and it applies at the other end of the market as well. I think, think about super, you think about, retirement of people in our age, maybe a little bit older, but it's also young people that are disadvantaged, by super and some of the changes here, like for young people to be under 18 and have to work over 30 hours before they get a cent in super. It's just wrong, and it's not a reflection of today's economy, today's labour market, and we need to change that. It's pretty simple. Every dollar you earn, we say, should include a proportion put away to super, regardless of who you earn that from, how you earn it, what form of employment. If it's earned by your labour, it should attach a 10.5% now, soon to be 11% super component for your retirement.
The last one I wanted to ask you about super was in response to what happened during COVID when the federal government enabled workers to access some of their super funds. And at the time I thought, you bastards, this was really, really sneaky. And I know that plenty of workers out there who needed access to cash at that time for legitimate reasons because of the financial constraints in their own home budgets took advantage of that. But I'm sure there were plenty of people out there as well that probably didn't need that second Sony PlayStation or that new pair of Air Jordans also access their retirement funds. Are we worried about this? Has this set a precedent? Is the genie out of the bottle? How do we address this? Or have people got a taste for this and are sort of saying to unions or bosses in workplaces, I want to get access to my super? What are we going to do about addressing this issue?
I think it was a terrible policy and a really, really bad reform. I guess it was the outsourcing of Social Security. Fundamentally, that's what the decision was. We just, the government outsourced it, and we had to pay for it. That was what they did, and they did far too successfully, unfortunately. Bad decisions, of course. Some individual made, and we can't sort of police for that always. But I think overwhelmingly the experience is one that hasn't quite worked for those that wanted to tear down the super system. I think what we're seeing is that, if anything, the engagement of people with their super has increased. The recognition that was a bad decision, both in terms of the public narrative sort of shifting against the quick easy buck, but the long-term ramifications for that I think are sort of winning the day. And I think that's a reflection of people thinking differently and engaging more maturely with their super as the system matures, and that's a really positive thing. And I think, to the government's credit, it's sort of thinking about having a national conversation about the objectives for super and really embedding the principles of preservation and universality into the system, not just legislatively, but more significantly, I think, in the community consciousness that super is a saving, it's for the long term, it's going to be there when you need it, and that's what this is about. And I think I'm encouraged by everything I see in this space, concerned, but I think the trajectory is that we are winning the hearts and minds of people to super being for retirement, to be preserved, there when you need it, in retirement, as sort of the path we're on. And I think our vision for this is really to see superannuation become one of the linchpins of what it means to be an Australian worker. It's up there with Medicare, it's up there with our education system, and I'm hopeful that we're just about there. I think with super, a bit more to go. I think the objectives will get us there, but really pleasingly in this space, it's going to be great to see. I think before the end of this financial year, we'll see superannuation enshrined in the National Employment Standards as a pillar of what it means to be an Australian worker, and a pillar in the NES that, again, just anchors this as an entitlement for workers for future generations to come. And it's going to be really exciting to see that done, and sort of know that that at least that part of this super battle for Australian workers is put an end to, for now anyway.
That's huge. Maybe you need to also get that toll driver from Toll Logistics, who was giving me a hard time with that EBA rollout, to do some ads about why it's important not to touch your superannuation before retirement as well. I'm sure he's got a few words to say. Scott Connolly, once again, thank you so much for your time coming on the show today. I've heaps of other questions I've left on the floor, so we're going to have to get you back for another check-in, maybe 6 months later, to see how things are progressing. But we just want to wish you and the team at the ACTU and all your affiliates strength to your arm and the work that you're doing right across the country for the next 12 months, and keep making those improvements for working people, because God knows we need a union.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunnstreet on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.